Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. Austin McCormick here, and today I have the privilege to speak with Christopher Ellis Osterbrock. Welcome to the podcast, brother.
Welcome. Thank you, Austin. Very happy to be here.
The topic of our conversation today is, the title at least, is A Brief History of Dissenters by Joseph Ivimey. As we continue in this conversation, our listeners will figure out why the episode is titled in that way. But before we get into our topic, since you are a first-time guest to our show, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, brother?
Yeah, I am a Baptist pastor by vocation, and I delve into history. I consider myself an amateur historian. That's my joy, and my hobby is Baptist history, and a little bit of systematics thrown in there. And I am I'm pastoring right now, and prayerfully for the rest of my tenure at First Baptist Church of Wellsboro, Pennsylvania. I've been here for about 3 months, and prior to that, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, for in ministry for 12 years. So I'm fresh to Pennsylvania, fresh to hunting culture, and lots of farmland and lots of mountains. I don't think that's relevant to the dissenters necessarily, but I had the joy of editing Joseph Ivimey's work. I don't want to jump too far in there, but I'm a father of 3 little girls, 6, 4, and 1, and my wife and I, we're a homeschool family. I'm not sure what else is interesting about me, but we're in the Charlotte Mason world, in the publishing world, in the copy editing world, all of that kind of stuff, as well as in ministry full time.
Well, thank you for that, and it is a joy to get to speak to you today. So thank you once again for coming on. And in your response to my first question, as you told our listeners a little bit about yourself, you did mention that you have edited a book by Joseph Ivimey, and that is the topic of our discussion primarily today. Yeah. A Brief History of Dissenters by Joseph Ivimey, republished by Hesed and Emet. So you and another brother, Chance Faulkner, who we've had on the show previously to talk about, James Hinton, edited this work for republication. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that process?
Yeah, that is, it's always interesting, the reprint style. And I work with reprints with H&E, so I'm the project manager for reprints. And Chance and I had a joy in going over Joseph Ivimey. This came out of a desire to get reprinted the History of English Baptists, which is Ivimey's 4-volume work. We're editing that to make it into 7 volumes, make it a little easier for the reader. But we chose A Brief History of Dissenters because it's such a nice, concise picture that Ivimey gives. And we wanted to make that not necessarily a modern reprint, so we're not rephrasing everything. But we do go through and we find archaic words or words that might mean something different now to modern readers, and adjust those. We go through and change punctuation. There's quite a difference in the long 18th century way of putting a sentence together, or for a treatise or what have you, and then looking at it today. Those guys would fail a lot of grammar school that we would understand, or English 101 at college level. But Ivimey writes in a really, really important way. He writes kind of like a sermon in his doing history. So we wanted to make that easy for the readers. And so part of that also includes changing headings, changing subheadings, adding those in, adding chapters. We did all of that for this work. And so it's not a pure reprint. There is modernization, but it's as slight as possible, and it keeps intact the flavor of Ivimey's writing.
Yeah, nice. So you've told us now a little bit about your interest in republishing works, and we've introduced the topic of our conversation, a little bit by talking about the work specifically that has been republished, A Brief History of Dissenters by Joseph Ivimey. But now that you've told us about yourself and this process, can you tell us a little more about Joseph Ivimey? At the Covenant Podcast, we love Baptist history, and so we're especially interested to hear about Joseph Ivimey. So who was this brother?
Yeah, Joseph Ivimey. Chance and I wrote the introduction to A Brief History of Dissenters, and his life is really fascinating because he was a second career pastor. So he was a tailor prior to that, but Ivimey, without giving a kind of a chronological history of the man in its entirety, he was brought up outside the church. He came to faith somewhere in his teens, early 20s, and he was an athletic guy. He was apprenticing because his dad was bad at finances and was more interested in yeah. I talk about modernization. You can kind of picture their family out in the suburbs. The dad is taking out too much credit to look the part, to look like a nice gentleman with his nice vehicles and anachronistically. But so Joseph had to work to help his family. He very quickly went from being in athletics, grammar school, all that. He wasn't very keen on all that stuff. So he goes into the tailor trade, and along the way, he comes to faith. And one instance that Chance notes at the beginning of the introduction to A Brief History of Dissenters is he gets attached to an Isaac Watts hymn. He really likes that hymn, and he really felt that he was called to the faith, and he starts working in that, and he gets this external call. I noticed these other men in his life start telling him, "Oh no, it looks like you're headed toward ministry." So he begins the work, and he's looking at himself as a strong lay person, and then it just keeps the way that the Lord works in providence. It keeps pushing him further, and at a time where he's thinking, well, I've got a lot of young guys, a lot of young church planters, a lot of these Baptist kids are coming up and getting into ministry. What does that mean for me? He eventually gets called into work under another brother. He becomes kind of the associate pastor, and within a year, he's taking on the ministry full time and selling his trade with his family. And so he through that, he gets connected. He ends up at Eagle Street, London, and he gets connected with a lot of the London Baptists at that time. And we see him pictured with Andrew Fuller before Fuller's death in 1815. He has a knack for, which you see this show up in his life repeatedly. He has a knack for recording things and taking that record and applying it to what's happening in the day. And Brief History comes out of his desire as soon as he gets involved in his church. In 1809, he has a sermon lecture for Eagle Street to kind of share Baptist history with his people. This is why we are who we are, and he calls it motives to gratitude. And we should be grateful for our history. We should remember our history. We should be grateful for these men that came up and were persecuted, and we're not facing that same level of persecution today. Praise the Lord. So let's be grateful, and let's be charged with this desire to hold on to our history. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of sporadic all over the place here, but Ivimey begins that kind of recording history there. And he likes to see himself as a background character, and he likes to see himself as taking place in something larger than himself, which is his love for history is not rooted in, let me get all of the dates recorded correctly. Let me do this unbiased approach in historiography. Let's just look at the context. He's very much concerned with doctrine, with doctrinal precision, with a regard for why are these men important to me? Not just what's the history of these men, but what do they do for Eagle Street today? What do they do for Baptists living in London, seeking to go forward in ministry, seeking to evangelize, seeking to grow their church? And so he has this knack for processing information as it makes sense to him in that day. And I believe that was part of the reason why men like Fuller and men like Pierce, Carey, all those good brothers, the Baptist Missionary Society, they called him and appointed him to work as secretary. And he worked under Andrew Fuller. He recorded. He worked with the Serampore mission in India, and we see him taking charge really there and making that his own work. And as he's doing that, people respond very well to him. And after his motives to gratitude, after that sermon, he prints it in 1809, and we see him kind of sit back and think and realize, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to be recording the Baptist Missionary Society. I want to be recording all these other mission works that are happening. I want to be taking all the letters that these guys are writing and all this correspondence that we have. This is our history. This is Baptist history. We have to be making sure that everyone remembers this and records this for the day. And you see that he's looking ahead, saying there's going to be guys in 2022 who are going to be talking about this stuff. We need to make sure it's pristine. And so he takes that role of secretary. He takes all the correspondence from the Serampore correspondence. He edits that. He takes his motives to gratitude and publishes that, and then says, I'm going to put together a 4-volume set. He says at the outset, I'm going to put together a 4-volume set of where Baptists came from until today. And you get it in the last volume, even sporadically through the other, not the first volume, but sporadically through the other volumes of his history of the English Baptists. You get over and over again this connection. He's seeing the London Baptist Church. He's interjecting in the history, saying, and so therefore we need to remember this. Therefore we have this church over here, and he's making all these connecting dots with regard to the London Baptists. And through that adventure, Ivimey continues and persists in Eagle Street Baptist Church. He sees, I can't remember exactly, over his span, just a dramatic increase in the membership and the roles. And this is a guy who Ivimey was on the very, if there's a continuum there on open communion, closed communion, he is as far in closed communion as you could possibly be. And I really take that to heart, to see his desire to really ground his people in the history of why they're meeting for communion, the history of why they're being evangelistic, answering the gospel worthy of all acceptation from Fuller. Ivimey's taking that very seriously, and yet he's not budging on doctrine. He's not budging on this is what membership looks like. This is what communion looks like, and he's willing to fight. He's willing to write treatise after treatise on closed communion, and so Eagle Street's growing dramatically, and he's really taking a part in the Baptist Missionary Society. He's really taking a part in missions work, and he begins to feel the necessity to move that forward in education. And so he opens up a lot of schools. He opens up a mission to Ireland, which becomes a passion project for him. Along the way, as a side note there, his desire for mission, he and his wife, I believe it was his second wife, his first wife died shortly after their marriage, but his second wife and him, they were going to move to Jamaica to work on the Baptist mission field there, but that they didn't feel that was the call. So Ireland it was, and Ireland he opened up, I make a note of it in the introduction. I don't want to take up too much time trying to find that, but he opens up like... And this is why I was asking you about editing, so that you can hear me flip through pages, but that's totally fine. He opens up several schools, 10,000 poor children in Ireland, 25 evening schools, or 91 weekday schools, 25 evening schools, 16 schools for women, for females. And that's Ivimey. You don't see Ivimey being touted as the picture of Baptist mission. But as he's recording, as he's acting as the secretary, he's in Ireland which at the time had no Baptists, very few Baptists. You had guys like Thomas Patient, you had other guys like that, but there's such a need for Protestant Reformation in Ireland, and Ivimey is there with his family, supporting it. And this is a guy who's not raising as much funding as Carey, as Judson would. He's as Pierce is raising for the rest of the Baptist Missionary Society. Ivimey's taking this on almost single-handedly. He pulls in a lot of other folk because he desired to see them take charge in leadership, but this is something on his own that he's working toward. And during that time period, he was also the editor for the Baptist magazine, and so he included an Irish chronicle, making notes. You can kind of picture that, right? You see that language. He's being the historian for his own Baptist mission, and taking notes, collecting letters, saying this is what these fellows are doing. This is what's going to be important later on, because we are in fact part of this history that's happening here, connecting it back. So Eagle Street, very successful. His Irish Baptist mission, very successful. Those schools, very successful. He begins writing not just on the history of the Baptist movement, but he begins writing on biographies. And during that time where he's really focused on those weekday and evening schools, he puts together a biography of William Fox, who's an educator who was really unique in his Sunday school approach. He puts together a lot of other biographies of men that he found to be very special and important. And so he's putting together a biography of William Kiffin. But early on, as he is writing it, somebody else publishes a biography on William Kiffin. And he says, oh, well, I'll just shove that in the drawer then for later. And if you notice a lot of his works, I have a big long list of some of his works here, but he's got dozens and dozens. And you see by those dates, and you see by the publishing, he's doing this by himself. He's raising the funds and putting the stuff out there just because he wants it to be out there. And so eventually he releases his William Kiffin. Eventually he releases a biography on John Milton. Eventually he releases a collection on, he had a lot of Roman Catholic works, kind of looking at their history and how it affects Baptist history. But he also has a biography that's a continuation of the Pilgrim's Progress, where he's noting history as if coming forward from the days of persecution, and looking back at what the modern pilgrims, he calls the pilgrims of the 19th century, what they're facing today. And so Ivimey is really attached to this history idea, to this idea of a methodology for producing history for the local church. All of this is meant to be for the local church. It's not meant to be necessarily for his contemporary men fighting alongside him. It's for them, but it's more for Eagle Street needs to know where they came from. Those who are buying these books need to know what Baptist history is. We've got lots of Presbyterians, we've got lots of Puritans, we've got lots of other nonconformists, but Baptists need to know where they come from. And so his last days at Eagle Street were spent finishing his 4th volume of the History of English Baptists, his other works. He wrote a lot of prefaces for other guys. He continued writing articles under different names for the Baptist magazine. And at the time when he really feels his health is deteriorating, he puts in charge Robert Overbury and gets ready to release and relinquish a lot of his control that he had. So he steps away from the Irish Society, he steps away from the educational societies that he was attaching himself to, and he steps away from Eagle Street eventually. He preaches a little bit here and there, but eventually he passes away in 1834. And interestingly enough, 4 years before he passes away, he remarried. His second wife had died that year, and he remarries. He was a man, he knew that he needed strong women in his life to help him publish this stuff, edit this stuff. He needed that Susanna Spurgeon of the long 18th century. So I didn't want to go over the top, but he's got a lot of wonderful, fascinating notes, and after a while we could talk about his contention with other magazines.
Yeah, that was really helpful. We really like the Baptists of the 18th century. We've had Dr. Haken on to talk about Samuel Pierce. We've had episodes on Andrew Fuller, and we've had episodes on William Carey, but never before have we had an episode on Joseph Ivimey. So really thankful to have you on to tell our audience a little bit about him and his interest in Baptist history and this volume that you and Chance have been, that you worked on. But I want to talk a little bit about this book a little bit more. So maybe we could get into the content within the book. What is this specific volume about? I know you've alluded to it a little bit, but what is it specifically about? I'm the worst at asking our interviewees a triad of questions. So I know that technically this is 3 questions at once, but what is this specific volume about? Historically, what did it mean to be a dissenter? And how did dissenters suffer for their faith, according to Ivimey? This gives you the opportunity to take the triad wherever you want to take
it. Thinking that through. What did it mean to be a dissenter? That is hugely important to the topic. Ivimey begins by discussing this is where the dissenters came from, and he looks at that as he gets into it. And I know we're not talking about the first volume of History of English Baptists, but he really connects that to Henry VIII. He connects that to a movement of lots of like-minded people who were seeking nonconformity. And Ivimey stresses that that this isn't just for Baptists. This is a very important movement for the restoration of the faith, for the coming against Roman Catholic tradition, coming against the Roman Catholic Church, but also coming against the Church of England. And he sees Henry VIII, he sees that movement coming into London, and the dissenters are those who would not follow a book, the Book of Common Prayer, would not follow a regulation that is not biblical. And so that he wanted to express dissenters are those who are dissenting against a state church. They're dissenting against a lack of religious liberty. They're dissenting against protocols that are being put into place. He goes all through the work discussing those, what you wear, what you have at the table, at the altar, what sort of prayers you're saying, whether they're your own prayers, how communion is conducted, and the membership of the church, whether that's a state calling or whether that's a voluntary decision to become a member of this particular church. And so he kind of casts a wide net for what dissenting looks like, but he very clearly articulates the dissenters are a present force that are being persecuted against in these various ways. And so there's a timeline at the end of the book that Chance and I put together that kind of gives you here's Henry VIII, and here are these different things that are coming up against the church, coming up against dissenters. And why will they not just let dissenters be? Why does there have to be a persecution against these people who are voluntarily choosing to meet together, to worship together? And what is the biblical attitude towards those? Is there an argument to be made, or is this a completely unbiblical argument for persecution? So that gives a bit about what the dissenters are according to Ivimey. How did the dissenters suffer for their faith according to Ivimey? He really touches on a lot of those acts, the 5 Mile Act, the Act of Uniformity, of course. He goes through just a long list of these different acts. And I mentioned Ivimey is really looking at history, his approach to history, and his model for not just studying history, but for writing it. And he wrote this in 1809. And so at the end, he comes back to it before its publication. And it was at 27. Yeah, 1827. He comes back to it and writes this appendix, and he says, "Look, I had prepared you all for this Lord Sidmouth case. I showed you that this was going to be happening, and so now let me write an appendix critiquing this." This is a man who saw himself. He is the dissenter. He is part of that history, and he's attached to the people that Henry VIII was coming against. He's attached to the people that the Act of Uniformity was coming against. He's attached to these people that are now coming up in the Corporation and Test Act. He's coming up. He's with them all the way, and so he sees in his methodology, I'm not just writing this stuff to show you what the past looked like. I'm writing this stuff to show you what the future will look like. And that is his approach in Brief History of Dissenters. And so he's saying, these dissenters are suffering for their faith. We are suffering for our faith, and we should expect that. And so as he's looking at the ways that they're suffering, he's always pointing ahead to this is how we are presently suffering. These things are attached. If they suffered because a book was telling them how worship ought to be done, and they did not feel that was they felt that was coming up against their religious liberty. He's a man very concerned with religious liberty. You read that all through the book, and you read that through all of his other writings. He's saying that this is persecution. This is suffering for your faith. You have to fight against this. You have to present a case. And if you're not suffering, it's almost that that plague-ridden Puritan world. If you are not suffering, then how do you know that you're persevering in the faith? If you want to experience perseverance, then take up a torch and go to the middle of the House of Commons and plead, preach against them. And so Ivimey is really calling to action. That's motives to gratitude. If I'm grateful, then I'm going to stand up in the House of Commons and fight this. And Ivimey shows that suffering as he mentions these men that come up and they preach sermons. They come up and they find other guys who will stand and read letters before King George, and then read letters before King George III. And he has a lot of respect for King George III, which us in Pennsylvania, one of the 13 colonies, we're not having that. King George is not a pleasant person to us, but to Ivimey is saying we have gratitude for King George because he is listening to us. He's listening to this persecution. He's listening to our suffering, our plight, and he's willing to take notice of it. And so Ivimey really presents the cases for suffering as being connected to how we are fighting for our religious liberty. And if we're not pursuing that religious liberty, we want to make sure that there can be lots of Baptist churches. We can make sure that our people are growing in their faith and have the ability to do that without the state church coming up against them. We can go into specifics about each of those acts and what they looked like. Some of those were looked at as, here is how I'm easing that suffering for you. I pass an act of uniformity that says that you have to wear these certain things, conduct your worship in a certain way, and now I'm going to alleviate that by presenting this other act. And we see that happen over and over again. And really what all it's doing is like the Test Act, the Corporations Act, the 5 Mile Act, all of those acts are really specifying, here is exactly how I'm hurting your faith. Here is exactly how I'm going to come up against you. We see this in Thomas Brooks and the Puritans. I'm sorry to go off on a Thomas Brooks rant, but it's important. Those guys who are meeting in the Moorfields after the Act of Uniformity, after 1662, they're thrown out of their churches. They've got parsonages. I mean, think of how devastating that is. I'm pastoring a church. I'm a nonconformist minister, pastoring a church, leading these people, shepherding these people, loving them, coming up beside them in worship through devastating events, through the Great London Fire of 1666, through the Great Plague of 1665, through the Act of Uniformity of 1662. I'm with my people, and the Act of Uniformity takes them out of their parsonages. It takes them out of their financial stability. And these men are yet leading their people through these devastating events and leading their people to worship. And then they come up with a covenantal act. think I pronounced that wrong, conventicle act. And they're saying you cannot at all have any sort of meeting. You're out in the Moorfields, which is a few blocks away for Brooks's case, but you've got William Bridge, you've got all those other good Puritan guys that we love, the predecessors to the Baptists, and we're looking at this London town. And all these people, these members of these churches, are then meeting in the Moorfields. They're meeting in these meeting houses, and this act comes, which is supposedly going to make them feel better, supposedly going to show that the King Charles II is working with the churches of England. And what it really does is allows for Christopher Wren, as the rebuilding churches after the Great London Fire, he is likewise going around marking churches that they can destroy. That's not a typical thing that we read about in history, but Christopher Wren is rebuilding hundreds of churches. But at the same time, he's labeling these other meeting houses and saying, you can go in and destroy this. You can take stuff off of these houses. You can go in and rip down their altars. You can go in and find their pews. If you need wood for a fire, go on ahead in. If they're meeting in here as Baptists, as nonconformists, as independents, if they're meeting in here, go on ahead. You're free to destroy this place. And so the Moorfields, the meeting houses, we see time and again, these acts are causing the people who don't like dissenters to come in and rip their stuff up, to come in and destroy their private property, to take over their religious liberty. And so Ivimey is taking note of that and saying each one of these acts is another act of persecution. It's not nullifying what they did. It's not saying that it's okay after this. It's saying you still have an entire population who can come in and attack you. The 5 Mile Act says you're not allowed to conduct business if you are choosing to continue to be a nonconformist. Then you do not have a right to these positions in government. You do not have a right to these positions in business. You do not have a right to freedoms of certain taxes. You don't have a right to in some cases to marry. And so these acts are coming up against, mind you, the Act of Uniformity is still intact. At the time that Ivimey is writing, it's still intact. It's just that they've made these other amendments and allowed for it. In fact, the Act of Uniformity is still intact today in 2022. There are lots of amendments to that make it seem like there's no law on the books against nonconformists, but no, it's certainly still the case. And so Ivimey is showing this suffering that we're taking part in is good because it's a fight for what is right and what is good, and it's a fight for our history. I hope that Puritan rant helps in some way show the passion that Ivimey is dealing with. He's saying we have to go to the House of Commons. We have to get people to read our letters. We have to, and he's not coming up as in fighting saying we need to go blowtorch the whole House of Commons. We don't need to go in and Molotov cocktail the Church of England. He's saying we need to go in and reform. We need to continue reforming. We need to go in and say, guys, this is your church. This is Jesus Christ's church. Not cut us some slack. No, get rid of these acts that are keeping people from the body of Christ. There was a triad. I think I got 2, maybe 1.5. I don't know.
No, that was helpful. To you, it may have felt like a rant, but I think that answers the question. And I think that's really helpful to understand how Ivimey was describing the suffering that dissenters went through. So thank you for that answer. It's obvious that you're very passionate about Ivimey and Baptist history, and you yourself are a Baptist pastor. So these are good things to care about.
In a place like America, we're not facing that. And it would do us well to recapture that, to think through those thoughts, to think through what it means to have that religious liberty. What are we willing to fight for in our worship? What are we willing to fight for? Because we don't have to fight for it. We don't put as much pressure on people to think that through.
Well, in relation to what you said, do you have any other tips for recovering Baptistic works or our Baptistic heritage, or at least in thinking about Ivimey's interest in Baptist history, do you have any tips for being a well-informed church historian?
Yeah. I think through I've got a bibliography sitting here about Joseph Ivimey, looking through his list of works, and it's so important to remember that these men are as passionate as they are because they're writing those questions out for themselves. And excuse me, as Ivimey is, uh, as I mentioned, I hope it's made clear. Ivimey is not looking at himself as a famed historian. He's looking at himself as a pastor seeking for Eagle Street to have a deep knowledge. He believes that if we want to know doctrinal truth, we have to know historical doctrinal truth. We have to know the history of it. We have to know the building of it. And as he says in his Dissenters, he makes mention of that. It's not. He talks about the Apostles' Creed. He talks about Baxter and the Presbyterians. Talks about Owen talking about the Apostles' Creed and the Ten Commandments and what are kind of what's kind of the shape of the faith. He goes into Owen and Baxter dealing with Westminster Confession, but he's saying we have to get to a biblical understanding of that history. He's not saying the Westminster Confession is awful. He's saying we need to go back and see what the precedent that was set for defining our faith. And he was very concerned of that, and he wrote about that. And if we're going to gather up our heritage and gather up our history, if we're going to be concerned, if we're going to become passionate about it, then we need to be writing for ourselves, and we need to be recovering for ourselves, and not to simply publish things for the sake of publishing them. Ivimey spent his own money, and he wasn't a wealthy man by any means, and he spent his own time documenting these things so that his church would understand, so that his church would know. And we see him in his reprints. He's concerned with reprints. He's concerned with those sorts of things. And that's a joy to me because it shows that this model for let's take up an old work, even for him, he in the beginning of History of English Baptists, the first volume, he just copies and pastes John Gill's treatise on baptism, and that sets the course. That's his preface for here's the History of English Baptists, John Gill, and then he goes back to the Waldensians and the Valley of Piedmonts, these random things that we have no idea what to make of them. And he's making footnotes, and he's making these connections. And for us today, if we're going to recover Baptist history, we need to be mindful of modernizing, not diluting and destroying what people have said, not taking out the flavor of their voice. Part of why we wanted to edit Dissenters and add subheadings and headings is to reveal this is an important work, and it's very readable, but it's very relatable. This is our history, and so to get into the work of a historian is to see what is useful to the church, and that means digging and doing the work, plotting, as Baptists love to do, plodding through and taking note of what was important to men like Ivimey, what was important to men like Gill, what was important to men like Keach at that time, and figuring that out. We don't have people fighting like the Third Ecumenical Council, fighting over the natures of Christ. Churches coming forward, sending their delegates, saying we need to fight, and look at all that's at stake. But Baptists need to have that mindset that there are lots of things at stake that we need to put and press before our people. So doing the work of digging up those old volumes. That was what I was going to say. The bibliography of Ivimey. There are dozens and dozens of works that have not been read since he published them. There's volumes, there's letters, there's correspondence that isn't noted, and that's to our detriment. And being able to recover that stuff just for our own people. That's the reason behind history is to present it to our churches, that it be remembered, and the reason why. And if we can't give a good reason why, then why are we fighting for it in the first place? I mean, Baptists believe in what do Baptists believe about communion? Well, let's consider that. If communion is important, if we're going to do it once a month, first Sunday of every month, why do we do it? Why do people have an issue with the wafers and the grape juice post COVID? There's lots of things to consider, and to consider them for the glory of God. Anyway,
that's helpful. Yeah, excited to hear about those tips of advice for recovering Baptistic works and Baptistic history. And Hesed and Emet does a very good job. H&E, I should probably call it H&E Publishing for our listeners, does a good job of republishing and getting Baptist works, specifically reprints and other types of work, into the hands of readers. So do you have any final thoughts pertaining to our conversation, or any updates related to H&E that you want to share with our listeners?
There's a couple things that are on the docket. H&E is working with Andrew Fuller Society and with the London Lyceum to put together what's called the John Gill Project, and those are reprints, and there's an abridgment of John Gill's Doctrinal Divinity, a body of doctrinal and practical divinity. Actually, it's a one volume abridgment that's meant for pastors and lay leaders. There's also going to be a series of volumes, 6 volumes. We're hoping to have out quickly, and I won't make promises on the quickness, but maybe before Christmas. That would be wonderful. But we're working on John Gill's spiritual characteristics, spiritual virtues that are labeled. He puts together the very brief little simple essays. And so we're having some volumes of that, and also the introduction of Doctrinal Divinity, Body of Doctrinal Divinity. The introduction really asks the question, what is theology? And so we have that edit coming out first for the John Gill Project. And I'm acting as senior editor for that project, so I'm very excited about it. Wrote the style guide for it, which is the nerdy copy editor kind of thing to do. I love that kind of stuff, making sure that it's readable, making sure that we have the footnotes where we want them and all that. And I should say we have a far better copy editor than myself, who will be handling the end result. But those volumes will be very exciting to have out, and very good for Baptists and even non-Baptists. Spiritual characteristics, virtues like Christian fortitude, humility, self-denial, resignation to the will of God, spiritual joy. All that stuff is really helpful for anybody who's in the spiritual life and in the life of Christ. Also, we have the History of English Baptists, as I mentioned in the very beginning, a 7-volume set that will be edited. It will be a very attractive set. We'll be putting out volumes periodically, kind of similar. It's not a critical edition. It's going to be far more readable to a layperson, hopefully. But we add in the dates. We add in, we take out those archaic words. We add in, change the syntax a bit. But that, I think we've got volume 7 that's just about ready, and that'll be coming out. I don't have a timeline for you, but that's something to look forward to with regard to Joseph Ivimey. But H&E is always working. There's always stuff that we've got in our queue to be putting out to people. So make sure to check the website and see what else is coming out.
Amen. Yeah. Well, thank you for giving us an update on H&E, and in general, thank you for coming on the Covenant podcast to discuss this work that has been republished, and to give our listeners a whetted appetite on learning more about Joseph Ivimey. This has been a really pleasant conversation on this brother. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.
And to our listeners, we do encourage you to check out this book on Hesed and Emet's website. We'll link to that in the show notes. Until next time, we want to wish you grace and peace.